Hello there tonight. We are going to slip behind the red lacquered doors of the Qin Royal Palace. Not the battlefield, not the Great Wall. No, tonight we step into silk-draped chambers, down corridors lit by flickering oil lamps where secrets rot beneath the perfume and the politics. You're about to meet a woman who was both queen and conspirator, a commoner who seduced his way into royalty using nothing but charm and allegedly something even more memorable, and a teenage boy who would one day become China's first emperor, but only after surviving a palace coup led by his own mother. And let's be honest, if you somehow woke up in this story, you probably wouldn't survive the night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The golden roofs of the Qin Palace didn't just reflect the sun, they deflected questions. Inside, everything gleamed: the polished floors, the lacquered screen walls, the sleeves of courtiers who spoke in metaphors and bowed in layers of embroidered silk. But beneath the gold, as always, were cracks. And one of those cracks had a name: Lady Zhao. You could call her Queen Dowager, or Consort, or simply Mother of the King. She was all those things. But she was also once a courtesan, or something close enough that court historians still argue over the technicalities. Before marrying into royalty, Lady Zhao had already been the lover of one of the most powerful men in Qin, Lu Buwei. He was clever, ambitious, the kind of man who saw kingdoms not as places but as puzzles. And when he met Lady Zhao, it wasn't just lust, it was calculation. So when she married King Zhuangxiang of Qin and bore him a son, the future Emperor Yingzheng, there were already whispers about timing, about parentage. Historians still debate whether Lu Buwei was Yingzheng's real father, but in the end, it didn't matter. The king died. Lady Zhao became regent, and Lu Buwei, well, he became something much more dangerous, indispensable. The palace moved on the surface like clockwork ceremonies, feasts, incense-filled rituals. But underneath it was a slow boil, the kind that fogs the windows before it shatters the pot. Yingzheng was 13 when his father died, too young to rule, old enough to remember. And Lady Zhao, she was still young, still beautiful, and very, very alone. Her son was busy learning governance. Lu Buwei was still around, but fading into the background. And Lady Zhao, surrounded by eunuchs trapped in the gilded cage of court protocol, began to feel the weight of her solitude. Here's a historical fact. In the royal palaces of ancient China, a queen dowager was technically the most powerful woman alive, but functionally invisible. She couldn't remarry. She couldn't be seen to desire. She couldn't even open a window without asking permission from a man who had once been her page boy. And you try living like that. Now imagine a woman in her prime with silk robes, empty halls, and a memory of love she wasn't allowed to name. That's the mood Lady Zhao was in when she began looking for companionship. And that's when things took a turn. It didn't begin with scandal. It began with whispers. Somewhere in the taverns outside the capital, a name began circulating. Not because of lineage, not because of merit, but because of a rumor about something, let's say, anatomical. His name, Lao Ai. He was no one. A drifter. A man without title, birthright, or fortune. But he had potential. Specifically the kind of potential that made powerful women curious and powerful men uneasy. Lu Buwei, ever the opportunist, caught wind of this. And you have to admire the logic. If he couldn't maintain influence through Lady Zhao directly, why not introduce a proxy? So he summoned Lao Ai. Not to dismiss him, not to threaten him, but to train him. That's right. A forgotten man from the streets of Qin became the project of the kingdom's most ruthless strategist. He cleaned him up, taught him manners, hosted banquets where the wine flowed, and Lao Ai was encouraged to let the rumors prove themselves. Imagine being paraded around as entertainment, a political pawn with one job. And Lao Ai, he delivered. Word reached Lady Zhao, first as gossip, then as an introduction. And just like that, the match was made. Only it wasn't marriage. It was subterfuge. To enter the inner palace, Lao Ai had to appear safe, and there's only one type of man the court trusted to serve in the Queen Dowager's private chambers, eunuchs. So they shaved his eyebrows, altered the records, paid off the right officials. He was given a new identity, one with nothing between his legs except lies. And inside those walls, Lao Ai became something else entirely. To the outside world, he was just another servant, one among dozens. But to Lady Zhao, who was everything she wasn't supposed to have, and they didn't hide. Not behind closed doors, not in the sound of footsteps echoing down empty corridors. Their love, or at least their arrangement, was loud in all the ways that couldn't be recorded. Odd historical detail. The grand historian Sima Qian includes Lao Ai's sexual performance in the official history of China, which either means it was incredibly impressive or incredibly scandalous. Probably both. That's where we'll leave them for now. A queen and her lover tucked between silk drapes and the scent of peonies, pretending the world couldn't touch them. But of course it could, and it would, because nothing in a palace stays secret forever, especially not when there are babies involved. Lao Ai might have begun as a rumor, a joke, passed over rice wine in the shadowy corners of Qin taverns, but by the time he slipped past the palace gates in eunuch's robes, he was already halfway to immortality. You see, most palace stories end in whispers. Affairs swept under lacquered carpets. Missteps punished in private. But Lao Ai's ascent didn't just continue, it accelerated. Inside the Queen Dowager's chambers, he became more than a lover. He became her obsession. It's easy to laugh at that from the outside. To think, oh sure, she fell for the guy with the big reputation. But this wasn't just lust. It was power. Lao Ai gave her something no one else could, a sense of control in a world that had stolen everything else from her. Lady Zhao had been a pawn her entire life. First to Lu Buwei, then to a dead king, then to a son who, though still a boy, carried more symbolic weight than a mountain. She was always someone's, always watched, but Lao Ai who was hers, entirely. And she made it known quietly, of course, but thoroughly. At first, she cloaked it in discretion. They met only at night. Her attendants were handpicked. The eunuchs who knew the truth were silenced with silk purses and subtle threats. But power has a funny way of loosening inhibitions. The more she gave Lao Ai, the bolder he became. And the bolder he became, the more she loved him for it. Before long, he wasn't just her secret. He was her project. Lady Zhao arranged for him to be granted a minor noble title, Lord Changxin. One day, he was a penniless impersonator. The next, he had his own estate, an army of attendants, and gifts fit for a duke. There's even a record of one banquet, where he arrived wearing robes embroidered with dragons, an honor reserved only for the king. And no one stopped him, because he didn't need royal permission. He had her, and then it happened. Or rather, they happened. The Queen Dowager became pregnant, which, if you've been paying attention, should have been impossible. She was a widow. She was sequestered. She was, according to official records, surrounded only by eunuchs. So when her belly began to swell, the palace held its breath. How did she explain it? With one of those classic, untouchable lines. A divine vision. Yes, the gods had appeared to her in a dream and instructed her to retreat to Yongcheng, the old Qin capital, for spiritual purification. It was the perfect cover. Yongcheng was remote, sacred, and just far enough from court scrutiny to allow for a quieter, messier truth. And in that ancient city, nestled between misty mountains and river bends, she gave birth. Not once, but twice. 2 sons. Sons that carried the blood of a man who technically wasn't supposed to exist. Now, historians still debate whether Yingzheng knew about the pregnancies at the time. Some say he was too young, too sheltered. Others believe he knew everything and simply waited like a tiger in tall grass. Either way, Lady Zhao wasn't hiding anymore. She was building. At Yongcheng, she lived like an empress. She expanded the palace grounds, brought in scholars, musicians, guards loyal only to her. Lao Ai, meanwhile, ruled beside her, not officially, of course, but effectively. He rode through the streets in golden chariots, hosted feasts with foreign dignitaries, even began appointing officials, and no one, not even the king, stopped him. Why? Because in the game of Qin court politics, visibility meant vulnerability. And for the time being, Yingzheng preferred to watch. Back in the capital, the young king continued his studies. He read ancient texts, learned military tactics, memorized the punishments for treason. He said little, smiled less. But his eyes never missed a move, and in those early years, while Lao Ai grew drunk on his own influence, Yingzheng was sharpening. Let's pause for a moment on an odd historical fact. Lao Ai, at the height of his power, began referring to himself as consort. Not prince, not general. Consort. A term usually reserved for official spouses of the ruling monarch, and people let him. Whether out of fear, bribery, or pure confusion, the court indulged this fantasy. Even some officials began addressing him with royal courtesy. One courtier, in a surviving letter, even referred to him as the Queen Dowager's moon, a poetic nod to his nights spent in her chambers. The flattery was thick, the embarrassment even thicker. But no one said anything, because saying something meant picking a side. And in Qin's royal court, picking a side could cost you everything. Meanwhile, the king grew older, taller, quieter. He began holding court sessions on his own, meeting with generals, asking questions about border security and tax levies. To the outside world, it seemed like a gentle transfer of power, the boy becoming the ruler. But inside, it was something else entirely. Yingzheng was counting who bowed a little too low to Lao Ai, counting who sent gifts to Yongcheng, counting which families rose in favor and which fell silent. He wasn't just growing up, he was planning. Lady Zhao, for her part, began believing her own myth. She'd always been good at rewriting her story, courtesan to queen mother to monarch. But now in the quiet halls of Yongcheng, she began dreaming of something larger, a new dynasty, one where her sons ruled. Sons unburdened by Lu Buwei's manipulations or Yingzheng's stoicism. Sons who laughed, who hugged her, who loved her. So she and Lao Ai made a plan. If anything were to happen to Yingzheng, their eldest boy would be next in line. After all, the people believed her divine story. The court dared not contradict her. And Lao Ai, he already walked like a king. But remember, palace walls are thin. Secrets don't stay secret. And while they were dreaming of crowns, Yingzheng was preparing something far sharper. Steel. That's the real tragedy if you think about it. None of them saw it coming. Not because it was hidden, but because it was quiet. Because the most dangerous man in the kingdom wasn't the loudest. It was the boy in the corner, waiting, watching, and counting. There's a moment in every unraveling when the threads start to tug. A dish is dropped in the wrong hallway. A drunk official repeats the wrong compliment. A letter doesn't arrive, or worse, it does. In the palace of Qin, the threads were beginning to tremble. It started as it often does with gossip. Harmless in tone, but pointed. A muttered joke at a banquet. A slip of protocol. Someone accidentally referring to Lao Ai not as Lord Changxin, but boldly, dangerously, as His Excellency the Consort. One servant overheard. Then two. Then a page boy reported it up the chain, unsure if he should laugh or bow. And Yingzheng, now nearing his early 20s, didn't laugh. He listened. Carefully. It's one thing for a scandal to hide in shadows. It's another for it to waltz into the banquet hall, silk-robed and grinning. By then, Qin was being quietly ruled by 3 men each in different parts of the kingdom, each pretending not to notice the others. First, there was Yingzheng himself, the legal king cloaked in ceremony and silence, building alliances with generals and scholars behind closed doors. Then Lu Buwei, the old chancellor, fading but still dangerous, clinging to influence like a drunk man to a collapsing scaffold. And finally, Lao Ai, who held no real title beyond what the Queen Dowager gave him, yet lived and acted as though the throne were merely waiting for him to sit down. The court was split. Not officially, no one declared sides, but you could tell by who toasted whom, who sent which gifts, whose children received promotions. Yingzheng, meanwhile, remained calm. But in the stillness he was gathering, and Lady Zhao was busy playing queen in exile. Yongcheng. The city she'd claimed as her retreat had become a secondary capital in all but name. Lao Ai had thousands of followers, now bodyguards, scribes, musicians, tutors for the 2 secret sons. She had her own ceremonial court, her own astrologers and archivists, even her own palace guards, trained independently of the main military structure. Odd historical detail. Some records suggest that Lao Ai began to commission songs in praise of himself to be sung at evening gatherings in the Queen Dowager's residence. They were written in the style of old dynastic hymns, except they weren't praising a dynasty. They were praising a man with no royal blood and an ego the size of Mount Hua, and yet no one said anything, because everyone assumed somehow that Yingzheng wasn't ready, that he was still the boy king who walked too quietly and read too much, that the throne, for all its symbolism, was something that could be toyed with, skirted, or mocked, until one drunken night changed everything. It was a feast. Of course it was. Yongcheng lit up in celebration, following a ritual honoring Qin's ancestors. It was a major occasion, the kind of public performance where appearances mattered, and Yingzheng made the journey himself, traveling to the ancient capital, with full entourage to show respect and perform the rites. The streets were packed, the nobles feasted, and Lao Ai couldn't help himself. Wine loosens many things, tongues mostly. And Lao Ai had been drinking all night. Surrounded by flatterers and hangers-on, he began boasting. He leaned across the table, half drunk, waving his goblet in the air like a scepter. His opponent, a noble named Yan Ju, known for being too serious and too proud. Words were exchanged, first playful, then sharp. When Yan Ju accused him lightly, perhaps jokingly, of overstepping, Lao Ai slammed his goblet down and spat. "How dare you resist me? I am the Queen Dowager's consort." The room fell silent, because that wasn't just arrogance. That was a confession. Word spread fast and sideways. Someone repeated it to a servant. A servant passed it to a guard. A guard sent word to the king. By the time the morning dew settled, Yingzheng had the whole story. And here's the difference between a child king and a ruler. The child reacts. The ruler calculates. Yingzheng did not call for Lao Ai. He did not confront his mother. He did not storm the banquet hall and demand answers. He called Yan Ju. The noble, pale and shaking, was summoned to the king's private chamber. He expected punishment, perhaps exile, at best a long scolding. Instead, the king asked one question. "Tell me everything you heard." And Yan Ju, mouth dry, told him. He spoke of Lao Ai's outburst, of the wine, of the laughter that followed, and then hesitantly of the rumors, about Lao Ai's true identity, about the children, about the guards at Yongcheng who answered not to the king, but to the queen mother and her secret lover. And Yingso nodded. No fury, no threats, just quiet understanding. Then he dismissed Yan Ju and gave an order that would by dawn change everything. Send no word, prepare the Shenwei Guard. Now the Shenwei were no ordinary soldiers. They were the king's personal elite, trained in silence and loyalty. While the rest of the court still believed Qin was a triumvirate of power, Yingzheng had been cultivating an army that answered only to him, and now he would use it. But of course, secrets don't stay quiet forever, especially not in a palace full of paid ears. Lao Ai, as it turned out, had spies too. Two of Yingzheng's closest attendants men who had poured his tea, buttoned his robes, had been bought, bribed with land coin and promises of titles once the new regime began. They overheard enough, not the full plan, but enough to panic, enough to know the king was moving. They sent word to Lao Ai and Yongcheng. Imagine the scene. Lao Ai, hungover and bloated from feasting, reclining in silk robes when a messenger kneels before him, pale as parchment. He knows. The color drained from Lao Ai's face. Not all at once, but in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, then something like terror. He turned to Lady Zhao. She too went rigid, because for the first time the roles reversed. They weren't the seducers anymore. They were prey. In that moment, desperation trumped strategy. They made a choice fast, reckless, and terrifying in its audacity. They would strike first. The plan was bold, or suicidal. Forge a decree in the Queen Dowager's name declaring an attack on the palace. Summon every loyal soldier, every mercenary, even civilians. Tell them the royal family is in danger. And they came. Thousands. Armed men, farmers with pitchforks, former soldiers. All believing they were protecting the palace. All gathering at Yongcheng's gates, not realizing they were becoming the fists of a coup. And inside, behind locked doors, Lao Ai and Lady Zhao prepared to kill the king. They lit incense for courage. They sent out gifts as distractions. And they rehearsed what they would say once Yingzheng was dead. It was for the safety of the realm. But they hadn't counted on one thing. The boy was already gone. He wasn't the cornered child they remembered. He was the sword waiting in silence. Dawn broke over Yongcheng with the gentle warmth of any ordinary day if you didn't know that rebellion was brewing behind the palace walls. The smell of rice porridge and roasted barley wafted through the streets. Market vendors stretched their arms, unaware that they stood in the path of a soon-to-be battlefield. Children chased each other along stone-paved alleys, giggling. Chickens clucked. Bells chimed from temple towers, and then came the footsteps. Heavy ones, boots, hooves, armor clanking. By the time most people looked up, the roads around the palace were flooded with soldiers. Not in orderly formation, not led by royal banners, but messy, frantic, unmarked. Mercenaries, farmers, retired veterans who had been summoned with urgency and no explanation. They were told the king was under attack, that the Queen Dowager needed protection, that enemies of the realm were storming the gates, and they believed it, because the order came with the seal of the queen herself, or at least a forgery good enough to fool most eyes. From behind silk screens, Lao Ai and Lady Zhao watched the crowd swell. Lady Zhao clutched her robes tightly at her chest, her face pale. Lao Ai paced, muttering calculations under his breath. They were gambling everything, because if this worked, if they could kill Yingzheng before his counterstrike, they could declare their secret son the new heir. The boy had noble blood. He had the Queen Dowager's name. And in that strange gray zone between truth and power, that might be enough. But here's what they didn't know. Yingzheng was already ahead of them. When the spy's warning reached Lao Ai, it was already too late. The moment the king had learned the truth, he'd mobilized not just any soldiers, but his soldiers. The Shenwei Guard, the elite, trained not just in war, but in loyalty. Their armor was dark, quiet. Their orders were not for capture, but elimination. Even more dangerous were the Shuan troop commanders, another inner circle corps of enforcers. They didn't just protect the king, they protected the state from itself. And they were already en route to Yongcheng. Yingzheng was still in the city when the rebellion began. He hadn't run, hadn't flinched. He watched quietly from a high chamber as the false soldiers amassed below. Then he stood, walked to the balcony. And in front of nobles, servants, guards, and gathered civilians, he made his move, his voice sharp and clear as the morning air rang out. Lao Ai is a traitor. He conspires with the Queen Dowager to steal my throne. Kill the traitors. Protect Qin. There was a pause, just a second, and then everything shattered. Some of the crowd, those who had rushed in believing they were protecting the royal family, froze in place. Others, smarter or perhaps just less invested, dropped their weapons immediately. Still others, those who had been bought by Lao Ai, turned red with panic and surged forward. But now they were no longer storming a vulnerable palace. They were charging into an army waiting for them. The Shenwei Guard descended like a thunderclap. Black-clad swords drawn, moving in perfect unison. From side streets, the Shuin troops flanked them, silent and deadly. Every gate became a funnel. Every courtyard a trap. The sound was unbearable. Steel against steel, screams, orders shouted, hooves smashing stone. Lao Ai's forces, hastily gathered and poorly disciplined, never stood a chance. Inside the palace, chaos boiled. Lady Zhao was in her private chambers, surrounded by attendants, too afraid to flee. Her younger son cried in a back room. Lao Ai grabbed a sword, an ornamental one polished more for show than combat, and shouted for the guards to hold the corridor. But most of them were already dead or running. Outside, Yingzheng issued a decree that turned every citizen into a potential soldier. To capture Lao Ai alive, reward 1 million coins. Kill a traitor, 50,000. Inform on a conspirator title and land. That did it. The city itself turned against the rebels. Street vendors armed with kitchen knives leapt from stalls. Palace workers sealed doors. Even a blind musician was said to have cracked a rebel's skull with a tuning peg. Historians still debate whether this was strategic genius or a sign of Yingzheng's cruelty. But the effect was undeniable. By nightfall, the rebellion had crumbled. Lao Ai fled the palace through the western gates, disguised in mud-smeared robes and a servant's hat. He rode fast, desperate, aiming for the mountains. But the king had anticipated this too. General Xuen, one of Yingzheng's most trusted commanders, had already stationed cavalry along the escape routes. As Lao Ai galloped into a narrow valley, he heard the whinnying of horses on all sides. Torches flared. He was surrounded. He didn't fight. Not really. A swing or two. A scream. And then the ropes came. They tied his hands behind his back and dragged him from the horse, his face scraping stone, the mud, and blood soaking into his silk. Yingzheng had him, alive, and now came the reckoning. In the capital, the king convened a tribunal, not a real trial, not in the modern sense, but a ceremonial condemnation. More than 20 high-ranking officials, all linked to Lao Ai's faction, were executed by the end of the day. Their families exiled, stripped of titles, some reportedly buried alive, though official records deny it. Odd historical note: over 4,000 households were relocated to the far southern provinces, an act that some scholars still argue was an early version of statewide purification. But the most brutal sentence, that came for Lady Zhao's children. Yingzheng ordered both of them, his own half-brothers, bludgeoned to death. They were infants. Court records describe it in detached, cold terms. Removed, eliminated, neutralized. No names were preserved, no funerals. Even for ancient China, it was a shock. But for Yingzheng, it was necessary. He wasn't just erasing a rebellion. He was erasing a claim. And as for Lady Zhao, she was not executed. But she might have preferred it. The Queen Dowager was stripped of her title, her jewelry, her attendants. She was sent back to Yongcheng, but not to the palace. To a secluded wing, heavily guarded, without music, without mirrors. She lived the rest of her life in isolation. No letters, no visitors, just silence. The woman who had once ruled Qin through beauty and wit now sat in a cold room, aging alone. And Lao Ai, he was brought before the court in chains. No clever words, no protests, just fear. His sentence: execution by dismemberment. But Yingzheng stopped short of performing it publicly. Perhaps to spare the court, perhaps to spare the city. The records say simply, he was taken, and he was made an example. His name became a warning, his story a ghost. And Yingzheng, he walked out of the courtroom with blood on his boots and fire in his eyes. He had won, but not without cost. Victory has a peculiar taste when it's won against your own blood. The halls of the palace were quiet in the days following Lao Ai's fall. Not with peace, but with unease. The kind of hush that settles over a place after a lightning storm when the air is still crackling, but no one dares breathe. Yingzheng had done what many thought impossible. He had crushed a rebellion from within, decapitated a faction that had threatened to overthrow him. And he had done it not through negotiation or appeasement, but with force, with speed, with absolute certainty. The boy who had once been sidelined by his own mother now ruled with terrifying clarity. But the kingdom hadn't yet caught up to the king, because even as Lao Ai's body was removed quietly, brutally, and thoroughly, the legacy of what had happened lingered. Not just in the bloodstains, not just in the empty chambers Lady Zhao once occupied, but in the structure of the government itself. Yingzheng understood something many of his predecessors had not. Power isn't seized once. It must be maintained. Consolidated. And it's purged onto Katikrom over and over like a wound that refuses to stay closed. And so began what would later be called the Prinpikn, first great cleansing of Qin. No, he didn't call it that, of course. He just gave orders. Files were opened. Names were read aloud. Officials who had laughed too freely with Lao Ai, who had sent their children to serve under the Queen Dowager's banner, who had ever once stood in Yongcheng for a banquet, were summoned. Some were questioned, most were sentenced. Many didn't return. You see, this wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about reshaping loyalty. Yingzheng didn't want to be feared the way tyrants are feared, shunned behind closed doors, while fangs waited in the shadows. He wanted fear and obedience, but also something harder to achieve: legitimacy. And that required rebuilding the court from the ground up. He replaced judges with soldiers, placed military men in charge of tax collection, created new positions tightly defined, rigidly overseen, where old aristocrats had once reigned with loose honor codes and inherited power. One historical fact: after this rebellion, Yingzheng banned any non-royal male from residing in the women's palace complex, regardless of their eunuch status, a rule that would last for centuries. He wasn't just closing a chapter, he was sealing it shut with iron. But change on that scale sends ripples, and not all of them land quietly. Some nobles fled the court, pretending illness or grief. Others stayed, but refused to speak. Some quietly began sending messages to rival states Chujiaoyan anywhere that might accept a disillusioned minister with secrets and skills to sell. Qin, for all its military might, was no longer a kingdom of alliances and inherited courtesies. It was a place of rules, and one rule stood taller than all the rest. You do not cross the king. Even Lu Bue, once the puppet master of the Qin dynasty, the architect of Lady Zhao's rise, felt the ice creeping toward his feet. He had hoped, perhaps, that by stepping back, by feigning ignorance of the Lao Ai affair, he might escape unscathed. After all, it wasn't his hand that forged the decree. It wasn't his name on the rebellion. And besides, hadn't he guided Yingzheng through his early years? Hadn't he some whispered, even fathered the boy? But Yingzheng no longer needed guidance, and he certainly didn't need reminders of his mother's lovers. The chancellor was summoned formally, politely, asked only to present a defense. No accusations, no threats, just a room, a chair, a king sitting behind a desk, silent. Lu Bue arrived dressed in the robes of his highest office. He bowed low and waited. Yingzheng said nothing for a full minute. Then, "You taught me that power must appear merciful, but never be merciful." Lu Bue looked up. "Do you remember saying that?" The old man nodded. Yingzheng stood. "And then show me how to leave quietly." And just like that, Lu Bue was dismissed from court. Not executed, not exiled, not yet. Just removed. But the message rang out like a temple bell. If he could fall, anyone could. Lu Bue would later drink poison after a final exile, but not before writing down the philosophies he once whispered into ears behind fans. His fall was quiet, almost sad, like watching a stage magician whose tricks had finally run out. And into the space he left behind, Yingzheng inserted his own men. Younger, harsher. Men raised in the discipline of the army, not the flattery of court. Men who owed him everything. The transformation of Qin from a kingdom into an wanjindom. Had begun. Historians still debate whether this was genius or tyranny, whether the king's reforms saved the empire or sowed the seeds for future collapse. But one thing is certain after the fall of Lao Ai. Nothing in Qin was ever the same, and yet there was one moment, one final echo of the old world that still had the power to shake the new one. It came in the form of a scholar, not a warrior, not a politician, just a man with ink-stained robes and a voice that trembled from cold. His name was Mao Xiao. You probably wouldn't recognize him in a painting. He wasn't handsome, he wasn't rich, but he had the one thing Wang Zheng wasn't used to anymore: honesty. After hearing of the Queen Dowager's disgrace, the execution of the infants, and the court's tightening grip, Mao Xiao did something unthinkable. He walked to the palace gates, sat down on the stone, and began to cry, not in hysteria, not in protest chants, but slow, deliberate weeping paired with whispered verses. The heavens are inverted, the earth is cracked, the king murders his own blood, the court is lost in silence. Servants passed by, courtiers turned their faces, guards gripped their swords, but Mao Xiao stayed, through the wind, through the night. As frost gathered in his beard, and finally word reached the king, Yingzheng didn't react publicly. But the moment the scholar's name was read aloud in court, the air changed. Some expected execution, others thought perhaps torture, maybe exile. But Yingzheng once again surprised them all. He ordered Mao Xiao brought before him not to die, but to speak. And the scholar did. He bowed deeply. But he didn't tremble. He said, "My life means nothing, but my words are true. You may boil me alive, but you cannot boil away the truth. The people will not love a king who slaughters his own family." There was silence, and then, after a long pause, Yingzheng smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just thinly. He stood, walked toward the scholar, and said, "Then live and advise me better." He made Mao Xiao Grand Tutor of the realm. Because in a court full of flatterers, he had found something rare, a voice that did not fear him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the one thing more powerful than fear. The frost hadn't melted yet from Mao Xiao's robes when whispers began stirring across the court. How had he survived? Why had the king spared him? What did it mean? It meant everything. Yingzheng didn't explain his decision. He didn't need to. His silence was as sharp as ever, but now it was accompanied by something else: unpredictability. Until that point, his rule had followed a certain rhythm: swift punishment, precise orders, zero tolerance for betrayal. But sparing Mao Xiao shifted the air. It introduced the possibility of mercy. Not soft mercy, not forgiveness in the warm, grandmotherly sense. No, this was tactical clemency. Selective, useful, calculated. And it worked. Court life adjusted accordingly. Ministers once frozen in fear began to speak again, carefully, cautiously, but with less paralysis than before. The bureaucracy moved a little faster. Soldiers drilled with more discipline, knowing that loyalty might be rewarded with more than survival. But not everyone celebrated Mao Xiao's rise. Some whispered he was a plant, a stage act, that the king had scripted the whole thing just to test the court's reaction. After all, this was a ruler who'd let thousands die to extinguish one rumor. Could he truly be moved by poetry and tears? Historians still debate whether Mao Xiao's protest was spontaneous or planned. Some argue that he had already been known to the king, part of a long game of palace theater. Others insist his defiance was real, and that in sparing him, Yingzheng revealed his most human moment. Whatever the truth, it changed the trajectory of the Qin court. Mao Xiao became a fixture in the king's daily life. He sat at court meetings offering quiet suggestions in a tone just shy of irreverent. He rewrote sections of Qin law to introduce greater consistency. He advised against mass punishment, arguing that fear was effective but respect was enduring. And in the most surprising development of all, Yingzheng listened. Not always, not completely, but more than anyone expected. One morning after a long winter of executions and reforms, the king asked Mao Xiao to walk with him through the palace gardens. The peach trees had just begun to bud. The riverbanks were still brittle with frost, and the air smelled faintly of pine and ash. Yingzheng was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did I go too far?" Mao Xiao didn't answer immediately. He plucked a falling blossom from the air, examined it, then replied, "No, you went as far as you needed to go. The question is, do you know where to stop?" It was the kind of answer only he could give and still keep his head. And Yingzheng appreciated that, because he knew the fire that had saved him from Lao Ai could just as easily consume him if left unchecked. He had seen it happen before. To his mother, "Let's talk about her for a moment. Lady Zhao, once dazzling, once unassailable, was now a ghost in a royal prison. She was not dead. That would have been too simple, too quick. Instead, she lived out her days in a palace wing that was more tomb than home. Her attendants were few and silent. The doors were locked from the outside, the mirrors removed. No music, no letters, no names. Her sons were gone, one publicly disowned, the others destroyed before they could form memories. Lao Ai was a smear on the history scrolls, and her face, once immortalized in portraiture and praise poems, was now a source of whispered discomfort. Yingzheng never visited her again. Not once. But he didn't kill her either. That was the paradox. He had been merciless to her legacy, but reluctant to erase her entirely. Some say he couldn't bear the guilt. Others believe he kept her alive as a reminder, a living consequence, not a martyr. She faded slowly. No records describe her final words, if she had any. When she died years later, no temple bells rang. No mourning period was declared. She was buried under a false name in a modest tomb without inscription, and in doing so, Yingzheng ensured that she would never again be a symbol for anyone, not of love, not of rebellion, not even of sorrow, only of silence. Meanwhile, the rest of Qin changed. The borders grew stronger. New roads were built connecting the kingdom in ways that hadn't existed before. Messengers moved faster. Taxes were collected more efficiently. Laws became harsher but more predictable. Odd historical fact, it was during this period that Qin's infamous standardized weights and measures first began to take hold. A cup of grain in one province would match a cup in another down to the grain. This might seem boring to us now, but at the time it was revolutionary. It meant control. It meant trust in the state. It meant one king. The remnants of Lao Ai's conspiracy were scrubbed from every record. His name was forbidden in official histories, though ironically, that ensured he would never be forgotten. The same way you remember a stain even after you clean it. And Yingzheng, always watching, always learning, took these lessons and carried them forward. He would use the same ruthless clarity when he eventually marched across the other 6 kingdoms of China. When he broke down feudal barriers, when he carved his name into mountains, quite literally. But beneath all that, beneath the conquering, the monuments, the laws, was the boy who had survived his own mother. That scar never faded. You can feel it in the way he treated family afterward. Distant, unforgiving. He had half-brothers from concubines who were quietly erased. Advisors who dared speak of parentage were dismissed, sometimes punished. Ungsho no longer saw family as a bond. He saw it as risk. And yet, the image of Mao Xiao crying in the snow haunted him in a different way. It reminded him that the people did watch, that their hearts were not one with military drills or legal codes, that they wanted to believe their king was more than a sword. So he allowed voices like Mao Xiao's to remain. Not loud, not numerous, but present. Tolerated. Because if fear was the blade, reason was the sheath. Together they kept the empire alive. And that's where we leave this chapter, not with a crown or a war, but a king walking alone in the early spring, trailing the scent of burnt incense and blossoms, thinking about how far he had come and what it had cost him to get there. There are moments in history when the dust settles, but only for a heartbeat. Yingzheng had cleared the court of vipers, but even a throne swept clean can gather shadows again. In the wake of Lao Ai's rebellion and Lady Zhao's fall from grace, the capital shifted tone. It was quieter now, less ostentatious. There were fewer feasts. The musicians played softer, slower. The laughter of court officials was cautious, rehearsed. Everyone understood this was no longer a place for comfort. It was a place of vigilance, and no one understood that better than Yingzheng. He was no longer a boy. No longer a puppet surrounded by layers of silk and scented distraction. He had tasted betrayal not in theory, but in blood. He had looked into the faces of men he had once dined with and ordered their deaths. But the thing about power is, once you've survived your first assassination attempt, especially one orchestrated by your own mother, you start to view everyone differently. Even silence becomes suspicious. He began sleeping less, waking earlier. He ate alone more often, or with his most trusted guards standing behind him motionless. Every report from every province passed through his hands. Every edict was redrafted personally. He'd learned his lesson. Trust was a liability. So he began building something no Chinese king had ever truly built before: a centralized intelligence apparatus. Now, they didn't call it that at the time, of course. There was no grand title like secret police. But the functions were there: networks of informants, silent watchers in markets and monasteries, spies hidden in border towns, in brothels and barracks. The idea was simple. What you can see, you can control. Odd historical detail. Yingzheng was known to randomly dress in civilian clothing and wander the streets of the capital at night, accompanied by only one guard. He'd eavesdrop on tavern gossip, peek into tea houses, question beggars. If he heard his name praised, he'd say nothing. If he heard it cursed, well, those people tended to disappear. The court began to realize that loyalty wasn't just political, it was existential. And still, even with absolute control, something gnawed at him. The question of legacy. He had seen how quickly influence could dissolve. Lady Zhao had been worshipped and then erased. Lao Ai had stood on the edge of supreme power and ended up a cautionary tale. Yingzheng didn't want to be feared briefly and forgotten. He wanted permanence, and permanence to him meant unification. You see, Qin was strong, yes, but it was only one state among many. The ancient land of China was still fractured: 6 other kingdoms, Chu, Zhao, Han, Wei, Yan, and Qi, each with their own rulers, their own armies, their own stubborn pride. But unlike previous kings, Yingzheng didn't want to coexist. He wanted to consume, He began preparing not with drums and horns, but with numbers. Grain stocks were tallied. Weapon production scaled up. Road systems extended. Rivers mapped. Military ranks standardized. Generals promoted not by birth, but by results. He didn't boast, he calculated. And he remembered every lesson Lao Ai had accidentally taught him. Lesson 1, influence is a slow poison. Lesson 2, love is leverage. Lesson 3, you don't announce your power, you demonstrate it. Which brings us back to the palace. While the outside world slowly suspected the coming storm inside the Qin capital, Yingzheng was finishing what Lao Ai had started, but in reverse. Where Lao Ai had tried to build a new dynasty through subversion, Yingzheng now destroyed the very idea of competing bloodlines. He erased alternate claims to the throne by rewriting court rituals. He limited temple access to only those of verified lineage. He created a strict system for who could even utter the word succession. He wasn't just securing the present, he was laying traps in the future. Meanwhile, Mao Xiao remained a soft voice in a hard court. Still tutoring, still advising, still surviving. One afternoon, he found a scroll on his desk. It was unsigned. The handwriting was fine, practiced, but uncertain. The message was simple. When I am gone, remind them how I began. Mao Xiao understood. For all his victories, Yingzheng knew the myth mattered as much as the man. And the myth had to start in pain. The orphaned boy, the betrayed son, the survivor of a coup by his own mother. That was the foundation. Everything else would be built on top. That same month, court painters were commissioned to produce a new official portrait of the king. But when the draft was shown, Yingzheng rejected it. Too proud, he said. He wanted a sterner face, shadows under the eyes, a mouth that didn't smile. And so the image we remember today, the iconic glare, the rigid jawline, the almost too still posture was born. It wasn't a likeness. It was a warning. Meanwhile, foreign spies began sending reports home. Hunter Qin is changing, they wrote. The boy king is not a boy anymore. He is building something, and while the other kingdoms laughed and dismissed the rumors, ah yes, the quiet king with dead brothers and a vanished mother, they didn't realize they were already in his jaws. Because while they mocked, he was watching their trade routes. While they drank, he was buying their blacksmiths. While they argued over marriages and etiquette, he was placing generals on mountaintops and counting the arrows. But even then, even as conquest brewed, there were nights when Yingzheng stood alone in the royal hall, surrounded by flickering torches and silence. Nights when he'd glance just for a moment down the hallway where his mother had once lived, and for a breath of time, just one, he might remember her laugh, the smell of her perfume, the silk slippers that used to slide down that marble floor. And then just like that, the thought was gone, sealed beneath layers of strategy, conquest, and law. She had chosen her side, and he had survived it. It was early spring when Yingzheng returned to Yongcheng. The peach blossoms had just begun to bloom, soft pink petals unfolding like sighs in the breeze, covering the stone pathways in a carpet of color that no longer belonged to anyone. The air was sweet, but still cold. Crisp enough that the breath from the king's horse fogged visibly as he dismounted at the ancient gate. He didn't bring fanfare, no banners, no court musicians humming a triumphant tune. Just a small retinue of guards who kept their eyes lowered and their swords quiet, because this wasn't a visit. It was a burial, not of bodies. That had already been done, but of memory. Yongcheng had once been the cradle of Qin's identity, the spiritual capital, the beating heart of rituals and bloodlines. It was there the great kings of old had once sacrificed to their ancestors. It was there Lady Zhao had fled under the pretense of divine retreat, where Lao Ai had played dress-up with power, where secrets turned into babies and babies turned into ghosts. And now it was silent. No footsteps echoed. The wind passed through broken lattice windows like a voice trying to remember a name. Trees grew wild along the southern wall. Ivy crawled over bricks that had once been swept daily by servants who no longer existed. The king stood still just inside the gate. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply inhaled slowly, as though even the scent of this place brought back the weight of his own boyhood, when everything here had belonged to someone else. To her, Lady Zhao's wing of the palace still bore her seal, though faded and peeling. It had weathered rain and snow, the weight of years, and the kind of collective forgetting that only empires can perform. But it was still there. He approached the doors slowly. They hadn't been opened in years. No need. No one had dared assign the wing to another consort or scholar or even servant. It was untouched. A shrine and a scar. He stared at the handle. His hand hovered over it for a moment, and then he lowered it. He didn't go inside. He turned to one of the guards, and in a voice steady as iron said, "Close it, stone it shut. No one enters again." And just like that, the last doorway to his mother's life was closed, not by time, but by decree. He didn't look back. That night, he did not sleep in Yongcheng. He left before the moon fully rose, riding in silence back toward the capital, his cloak whipping softly in the wind, carrying nothing but the weight of things unsaid. Back in the capital, the pace of change had only accelerated. Palace walls were being repainted, not with art, but with maps. The sound of poetry was replaced with the scraping of quills on census scrolls. The scent of incense gave way to the metallic tang of newly forged iron. Even the laughter had changed, more guarded, shorter, less like joy, and more like survival. The courtiers were adjusting. They no longer dreamed of favor in terms of wine and robes, but in logistics and loyalty. The ones who rose fastest were those who brought news from the provinces, who filed reports with no embellishment, who learned to say yes, Your Majesty, without adding a single word more. And Yingzheng, he was everywhere, not physically, but in presence, in command, in the sheer pressure he exerted on the court. He was reading reports about soil conditions in northern valleys, personally reviewing timber ledgers from eastern forests, demanding daily updates on border garrisons, even if no one had crossed the border in months. It was obsession, and it was effective. For the first time, Qin wasn't just a kingdom with a powerful ruler. It was becoming a machine. One where everything, people, laws, metal, silence moved together in rhythm. To support this, Yingzheng made a decision that no ruler before him had dared to pursue so thoroughly. He would standardize everything, not just tax codes or punishments, but language, weights, measures, even the width of cart axles. Because if a man in the north couldn't understand a letter from a merchant in the south, how could you build trust? And if trust didn't exist, the empire would never be more than a collection of misunderstandings. He wanted unity not through kindness or cultural festivals. He wanted it through structure, and so the writing script was simplified and enforced. Weights were recalibrated. The shape of coins was dictated from above. A mile became a mile, a liter a liter. No more local systems. No more provincial pride. Only Qin. Odd historical footnote. The king even issued a list of approved character styles for royal scribes, including a precise angle at which each stroke should begin. Too steep and the message would be sent back, rejected, rewritten. Some might call that madness. But Yingzheng called it order. Even Mao Xiao, loyal as he was, began to voice small concerns. Nothing dramatic. Just questions. Your Majesty, he said one evening, standing beside a table covered in blueprints and provincial seals, when everything is the same, do we risk forgetting who we are? Yingzheng didn't look up. He just said, who we are was what almost destroyed us, and there was truth in that. Because the chaos of identity had nearly cost him his throne, his own mother had used the vagueness of titles and the chaos of court rituals to smuggle in a false family. Now he would make sure that no such confusion could happen again. No fake eunuchs, no secret sons, no more lies buried in lace. From now on, everything would be recorded, accounted for, verified, and once recorded, remembered only in the ways he allowed. It was around this time that the scrolls began disappearing. Not dramatically, just quietly. Scrolls from Lady Zhao's years, records of appointments she made, letters sent between her and former officials, poems once written in her honor, even court songs with her name in them. One by one they were replaced, corrected, or simply gone. Even Lao Ai's name began to vanish. He became the traitor, the false consort, the incident. Never a man, never a name. He had wanted to be remembered, and so he was only as a warnterms. And in this quiet rewriting, Yingzheng ensured something far more enduring than conquest. A clean slate, a palace reborn, a kingdom streamlined, an empire coming. He stood now not just as king of Qin, but as the man who would soon lay claim to all of China. And behind him, silence. Silence where a mother once whispered. Silence where a lover once laughed. Silence where betrayal once grew like mold behind the curtains. It was all gone now. He had walked through it and never looked back. There was no parade, no ceremony, no announcement carved into stone or read aloud at sunrise. But everyone knew. Qin was no longer just one of 7 kingdoms. It was becoming the center, and the man at the center of it. He was something new entirely. The courtiers still called him Wang King, but the title felt too small now, like a robe sewn for a boy that no longer fit his frame. He moved with the calm weight of inevitability, as if history itself had already been carved, and he was simply walking its path. But behind that calm was calculation. Yingzheng understood something that his enemies hadn't yet figured out. Something Lao Ai had never even imagined. Fear isn't enough. Fear made people obey, but it didn't make them stay loyal, Wantotuk. It didn't make them build. So while his armies trained, while his borders thickened, while new roads snaked across provinces like veins, he started doing something even more dangerous. He started rewarding people, not for birth, not for flattery, but for results. And a farmer who improved his irrigation system got a tax cut. A blacksmith who produced better arrowheads received grain subsidies. A local official who enforced laws fairly and without bribery might find himself invited to court. It was unsettling, because it felt almost generous. But it wasn't kindness. It was a deeper form of control. Yingzheng was giving people a reason to prefer Qin, to feel that under his rule, they mattered. Even just a little, odd historical detail. There's an archived complaint from a nobleman in the state of Chu who wrote, "The commoners of Qin walk straighter than ours. Even their beggars quote the law." He meant it as an insult. It sounded like a warning. Back in the capital, the reforms kept coming. He abolished hereditary titles for anyone outside the royal line. He reshaped the legal code to remove vague terms like dishonor and insult, and replaced them with measurable crimes, theft, slander, sabotage. He introduced standardized uniforms for government officials color-coded by rank. Even their hats were measured. Historians still debate whether this was about dignity or visibility. After all, in a court where deception once ran rampant, seeing an official's exact rank at a glance may have saved more than one life. And while the kingdom reshaped itself under his watchful eye, Yingzheng turned back to the one thing that had nearly destroyed him: family. More specifically, the idea of family. He no longer trusted it. He'd seen what it was like when blood turned against blood, when a mother could choose ambition over protection, when siblings were pawns in power games. So he did something almost unheard of in Chinese royal history. He stopped producing more of it. For years, Ying Zheng refused to name a queen. He took no official consort, and though he had women in the palace, concubines, attendants, none were allowed to raise their children in the main court. No names were announced. No heirs were presented. It baffled his ministers. A dynasty without succession was like a bridge without beams. What would happen when he died? But that was the point. Ying Zheng wasn't thinking about Shakan dying. He was thinking about lasting. If he could unify the realm, standardize its language, its laws, its economy, its rituals, then it wouldn't matter who came after him, because the system would outlive them all. And so he poured himself into that project with monastic focus. Even the architecture began to change. The new government buildings were simple, angular, functional. No elaborate carvings of gods. No ornate lotus windows. Just stone, wood, iron bolts, structures that could take a beating and still stand. And in their shadow, the old guards began to vanish. Those who had once whispered behind fans during Lady Zhao's reign, who had smiled at Lao Ai's jokes, who had shrugged when the king was still a boy. They either retired, fled, or simply disappeared. Their replacements, hard-faced men from the provinces. Some were farmers who'd proven themselves in regional courts. Others were former soldiers with rough hands and better aim. Many had never even seen the palace before being summoned to serve. But they were loyal, not to the idea of monarchy, not to the legacy of a bloodline. It's him, because Ying Zheng had given them a life worth living. And in return, they would defend it. But this transformation didn't go unnoticed. The other 6 kingdoms, Chuzhou, Hanwei, Yanqi, began to panic. Their spies sent letters soaked in fear. He's not playing king anymore, they wrote. He's building an empire. The rulers held emergency councils. Some suggested assassinating Ying Zheng before he could grow stronger. Others proposed forming alliances, an anti-Qin coalition. But it was too late. Because while they were arguing over maps, he already had boots on their borders. He'd sent surveyors undercover as traders to sketch their rivers. He'd recruited blacksmiths from rival cities with better pay. He'd even seduced a few ministers with promises of land once their kingdoms fell. He didn't just prepare for war, he prepared for aftermath, and all of it every sword forged. Every decree signed was shaped by the same memory, that moment in Yongcheng, when his mother had nearly taken everything, and so he left nothing to chance. Not titles, not children, not borders, not words. Even his name, once just Ying Zheng, began to shift. People started whispering a new title, one no king had ever used before. Huangdi, Emperor. It wasn't official yet, but it was close. And the old world built on shared rule, soft power, and the ever-turning wheel of royal blood was dying. Because now there was only one center, one will, one fire. And in that fire, he had burned every trace of Lao Ai, every whisper of Lady Zhao, every softness that might slow him down. He had not just survived betrayal. He had used it, turned it into steel, and the world would feel it soon enough. By the time the title became official, no one dared speak of it as a surprise. It was 221 BCE, when Ying Zheng, king of Qin, conqueror of the 6 kingdoms, stood before his court, dressed not in silk embroidery, but in robes of a new design sewn to reflect the weight of something no ruler had ever dared claim before Tongtuns. Totality. He did not ask to be called king any longer. He declared himself Shi Huangdi, the Chactin, first emperor, Taktun, of a unified China, not the king of Qin, not one among equals. The only, and for once the court did not whisper. They bowed, not just in deference, but in exhaustion. because by then the resistance had long been broken. The coalitions failed, the wars won, and the idea that anyone could challenge him felt almost laughable. What remained was the work of permanence, and he threw himself into it with the same obsessive focus that had shaped his childhood revenge. His empire needed bones, so he laid them. He ordered the construction of roads that would stretch across the land, like arteries wide enough for 6 horses, paved with crushed stone, aligned by astronomers. He connected cities, provinces, military outposts, and temples into one throbbing network. For the first time, a merchant could travel from the east to the far west without changing coins, language, or law. That's not just administration, that's power. Odd historical note. He also introduced standardized axle lengths for carts. Not because he cared about wagons, but because they wore grooves into roads. And if every wheel was the same width, the ruts would form evenly. Efficient, predictable, just like his rule. His next move, burn the past. Literally. He issued the infamous order all private collections of historical texts were to be surrendered. Philosophical works, clan records, rival versions of history, all confiscated. Only texts on agriculture, medicine, and divination were spared. The idea was simple: erase contradiction. If history remembered differently than the emperor commanded, then history was a threat. Some scholars resisted. One small group, loyal to Confucian, thought hid books in the walls of their homes. Others tried smuggling them to distant provinces. One even tried fleeing west carrying scrolls in his sleeves. Most were caught. Some were executed. Others were buried alive. Historians still debate whether the first emperor personally approved those executions, or whether local officials, eager to impress him, carried them out too zealously. Either way, the message was clear. There would be no second version of the story. Only one. His. Meanwhile, the Great Wall, the thing we so easily picture now in postcards and drone shots, began as a brutal patchwork. Not a single wall, but many stitched together from the bones of laborers who died building it. It wasn't built for beauty. It was built to keep northern invaders out, and to keep his own people in, because while he'd unified the realm, he hadn't forgotten what had happened in Yongcheng. He hadn't forgotten how easy it was for loyalty to be purchased for blood, to betray blood for power to shift hands when no one was watching. So he watched. He created an internal spy network more sophisticated than anything Lao Ai or Lady Zhao had ever dreamed of. There were watchers in every province, in every court, in every home that mattered. They were called Yushi Dafu, but everyone knew what they really were. Ears for the throne. It wasn't just fear, it was surveillance. And yet, somewhere beneath all the granite and certainty, there were cracks. Hairline fractures invisible to the world, but felt in the long silences of the palace. Because while the emperor could control his ministers, his armies, his historians, he couldn't control time. He was aging, and for the first time in decades he was afraid again. But this fear wasn't of rebellion, it was of death. So he turned to the one thing no conqueror could ever defeat. Immortality. He funded expeditions to distant lands in search of elixirs, ordered Taoist alchemists to create potions, swallowed mercury believing it might lengthen his life. Odd historical fact. He even sent hundreds of young men and women across the sea to seek the mythical islands of the immortals. None of them ever returned. Historians now believe it was a tragic obsession. A brilliant mind so bent on survival it consumed itself. And still he built his final project, a mausoleum unlike anything the world had ever seen. Beneath the earth, he commissioned a sprawling tomb city, complete with rivers of mercury traps against looters, and thousands of life-size soldiers made of terracotta to guard him forever. Each soldier had a different face, each one hand-sculpted, because even in death he demanded order. And then one night he died, alone, on a journey between provinces. His attendants panicked. They hid the smell with cartloads of rotting fish, continued the procession as if he were still alive, sent messages ahead in his name. Because they knew if the empire learned too soon, it could unravel, and yet it didn't. Because his systems held, his laws held, his terror held. Even without his breath, the machine kept running. But it was never the same. In the years that followed, rebellions returned. The dynasty faltered. His successors failed. But the ideas of China, unified, centralized, ruled by law, remained, because that was his real legacy. Not the wall, not the mausoleum, but the blueprint. And where had it all begun? With a scandal, with a woman behind a curtain, with a man who wasn't a eunuch, and a love that was never supposed to exist. With betrayal, and a boy who learned to turn betrayal into blueprints. That boy became the first emperor, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. So here we are, drifting softly at the end of a very long journey. A tale that began not with greatness, but with whispers behind silk screens of secret lovers, hidden children, and a power that slipped through fingers slick with ambition. A mother loved too fiercely, a commoner rose too quickly, and a boy still learning the shape of his own voice had to decide what kind of ruler he would become. He chose fire, but also iron, and brick, and law, and silence. The rebellion of Lao Ai wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was the blueprint for an empire. It taught Ying Zheng that love is unstable, that family is fragile, and that control must be absolute or not at all. He buried his mother, erased his rival, and built a world where such risks would never rise again. And though his dynasty did not last, his vision did. And maybe that's the real story we carry to sleep tonight. That power once tasted never really disappears. It just waits. Beneath stone. Behind doors! Between breaths. So close your eyes now. Let the silence settle in. And remember, empires rise. But sleep is eternal.